Good morning. It's nice to be back here on Facebook Live. Today we're talking about grief and loss. And I was thinking about, a couple of things this morning as I was preparing for our session today. And I was thinking, my goodness, I know for everyone the timing's a little bit different, but it's been about 1 year since news around COVID and not being able to be connecting in person with the bulk of uh, our family and friends, and there's many of us that haven't seen uh, loved ones or friends in different parts of Canada or different countries. Um, and I was just thinking, wow, like in some ways, it's you know, if there's anything about grief and loss, today is certainly represents. It may not be death, but it's certainly loss in a different way, and how many people have had to grieve or have had to work through loss of someone they love and care for, and maybe they couldn't be there, or they could only be there in little bits. So that sort of struck me today as I was preparing for Facebook Live. The other thing that really hit me, and maybe it's just more of a personal, was the death of Walter Gretzky. This Canadian icon, and just his funeral was live, and watching Wayne talk about his dad, and sort of these incremental losses throughout the year, despite his dad still being a force in Canadian culture and hockey, and being very active, and lots of um, meaning and purpose to his life. It just struck me like, oh, it was a real loss for our country too. So I just wanted to take some time to acknowledge those two particular areas, or two events, I suppose. Uh, the other thing that I really want to be clear about is, today is just really about acknowledging grief and loss, and hopefully to point you in the right direction around some other great resources that we have at Family Caregivers of BC, that we tend to lean on and that we tend to use. And the other thing that I really want to also acknowledge is that I'm certainly not an expert in grief and loss, um, and certainly have looked to the community of individuals that perhaps bring more depth and experience in this particular area. So this month in particular last month, we've been really focusing on grief and loss. And we've had lots of opportunities to have guest speakers on our podcasts. We've had lots of great blogging around grief and loss. Um, the nature of my work is come up against grief and loss and death quite regularly, with some of the aging elderly clients that I work with. And so often I do draw from my own personal experiences, just around trying to provide a story behind some of the feelings, or some of the common areas around grief. So one of the highlights, which I thought was a really good place to start, was this idea that grief is a universal experience. And Tricia Wallace, who's a clinical counselor and who has written a recent blog on Family Caregivers of BC, talks about this idea of a universal experience. And I thought it was just such a great way to phrase it. And grief isn't always about death. It's sometimes about loss leading up to death. Sometimes it's loss in ourselves, loss in the person who's dealing with the disease or the illness. And there's so many different types of loss that it's hard to sort of pull everything together and pinpoint it. So for some people, it's this ambiguous loss where they're um, you know their feelings come and go depending on where the care recipient or the person they're caring for, where they're at in their illness. Sometimes it's the anticipatory grief that we often reference, specifically around individuals with neurological um, trauma or dementia, and this idea that we're watching the loss unfold, and we're experiencing the grief well before death happens. There's this idea of obviously sudden death, or with a terminal illness. Often, maybe there's the time to grieve or the time to accept it, becomes incredibly short, and it's very intense, and there's a lot of not a lot of time to process in that particular moment. So grief is universal, but it's also very, very unique and individual. The other thing that, as I was doing more reading and listening to some podcasts, was this idea that I think, culturally and societally, I think sometimes we can still take on these expectations of how we travel through grief or how we deal with it or how we manage it. And I was reflecting on my own family and the loss of various friends and family, and in particular my dad, which was a number of years ago. But just sort of this or how watching other people grieve and wondering if we're grieving the way we should be. And I think this idea that individuals will talk about the idea that grief can be longer than we anticipate or expect. And so for some individuals, that grief, takes place over a number of years. And for others, it's shorter, depending again on the person they were caring for, and the disease process, and all of the factors leading up to the actual event of death. So for some with a terminal illness or a very sudden death, the response might be really more around anger, and this more physical, deep response to that sudden event, or something they just weren't anticipating. Whereas for caregivers with anticipatory grief, or this long gradual loss of someone with a chronic illness, many describe it as a relief. It's often followed by guilt, but it's relief that it's over for the care recipient, but also for themselves as a caregiver. So I just wanted to bring this idea of that grief is universal, and yet it's incredibly individual how we process it and how we work through our own process of grieving the loss of a person that we care for. So we're not going to kind of list all of the responses to grief. There's some really good information out there, and we're going to have some comments below with some specific resources. But I think the other thing around grief too is that it affects us as a whole being, and our physical responses come out in many different ways. For some individuals, it's they're just so tired, or others they become really activated, and they're wanting to do something to help mitigate or to try and release that energy. Other individuals feel pain in ways that they haven't felt pain before, and so there's a real physical response to our grief. And of course the emotional piece is often what we might see from someone's body language and how they're acting, and that's everything from anger to depression to anxiety to sadness, to relief, to guilt. Again, it really is dependent on the type of loss being experienced. And for some individuals, it also sort of represents the spiritual piece in whatever format that is, whether it's religion-based, faith-based, whether it's your own sense of how you interact with the world. That often we start to come back, to our core selves and question our own, faith, what matters to us. That often, is a piece that, with reflection, is a really important part, I think, of grief, but also this idea that it is also about continued living and what we're taking from the experience and bringing it forward. So I wanted to finish up by these ideas of that other wonderful experts have talked about supporting someone who is grieving, but also how to support ourselves. And I think the key word is support. And what came to mind today as I was reading and preparing was this idea of connection, but leaning on, so leaning on our support, also leaning into the grief. And whichever support that is. So for some individuals, talking to someone or talking to being a part of a support group is really important, and that's a way for them to share their experience, to share their feelings, to have a safe place to do that. For others, it might be connecting, with their trusted circle, and we talk about our trusted circle of connections, and being able to lean on our community of support. This idea of leaning in, so this idea of letting the feelings flow. Obviously, there are times where we want to be able to function still, and I'm thinking about a particular situation where if we have to work, and we're choosing to work, being able to find ways to use that distraction as a way to even take a break, because that's one of the other. It's great to let feelings flow. What we also read is that sometimes taking a break from the grief is really important too. Finding something that is a restorative activity, or something that just distracts us for a bit, so we can stop thinking about the loss, and we can enjoy a particular moment, or enjoy laughter, or just have a distraction. Those are also really important things. One of the common themes is this idea of journaling, and whatever that looks like. And journaling for some caregivers is actually part of a process that starts long before death. And so journaling as a way to even be able to process and connect their caregiving experience to loss, and during that whole process, as well as afterwards, is often a really good way, or it's a very common way for some individuals to be able to help work through their own grieving process. Tricia talked about this idea of restorative activities and rituals, and I thought it was such a lovely reminder that there are certain marked rituals that we do, as a society, and pre and post COVID, those can look different. But this idea of these memories, or these particular activities that remind us of the individual. And it's really interesting this morning. So I have a beautiful tea set that my grandmother gifted to me, and it's primarily for display, but I still use it on occasion. But it's this sort of this reminder of her life lived, but also what she represented, and some of the key words that she imparted on me before her death are still words that I end up living by. And so for me, that small beautiful tea set is just a daily reminder about the key messaging that she left behind for me prior to her death, and also to signify the importance of our relationship, and and what it brought to me. So whatever that is, so sometimes it's it's a keepsake, or it's a particular ritual that just focuses on that life lived. And then this idea of restorative activities, so things that bring us back to a place of renewed energy. They can be really small activities. They can be a daily activity that really helps nurture ourselves. So I want to finish there for today, and I know we've got some wonderful resources and some wonderful experts that really can bring a more in-depth discussion around the different types of grief, and speaking to various experiences, and even giving more information on activities to help support us through a loss. And I just want to again thank everyone for coming today, and for sharing in this Facebook Live. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you next month. Bye for now.